time to get started. The usual reminders, cell phones, please turn them off. Silence them, and we'll get going here. Eric has the little sock that we pass around. Once again, we depend on a little bit of funding that comes out of the January programs. The biggest crowd we ever have in the old building here during the course of the year. And if you're generous putting things in the sock or signing up with a membership, we appreciate that. It's just going through the year. So I'm Carl Vercouteren, and I've been at this, well, I guess all 46 years of these history forums, one way or another. We always take a deep breath in February because we get weather forecasts like we had this week. Wintry mix today. Well, where is it? So another full house, another good crowd. We have door prizes after a while. If you have not put your ticket stub, one stub or the other, put your name on it, or just hang on to the stub that has a little number on it. And we'll have a drawing after a while for some door prizes. So I'm doing the immediate introductions because our president of the old original Wasco County Courthouse is doing the program today. He says that Jacqui was the one who put all of this together, but he's the one who's fronting the thing and going to be up here speaking. Is that right, Eric?
Yeah, more or less.
More or less. I'm sure they both put a lot of time and effort into this, and we appreciate all the work that they have done to really attract the Chinese community in our town. If you go out to the Discovery Center, you see a kind of a mock-up of what the Seufert Cannery canning floor looked like. I always think when I go through that part of the Wasco County Museum part of the Discovery Center that the only thing missing is the smell. Susan, you might consider adding that somewhere. It would be interesting. So we're going to find out about the China crew at the cannery. The cannery, of course, is out near where the dam is now, where the interpretive center is for the dam. If you go down the hill from there just a little ways, you see the old foundations of the cannery buildings. We're going to find out a lot more about that, and I want to introduce Eric Gleason. Eric.
Well, thank you, Carl, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I know you've braved this severe stormy weather to get here today, so that's always a good thing. We're happy to welcome you here. It's the 46th year of doing these programs, so it's quite an impressive thing that's gone on for a long time here. Jacqui and I moved to town in 1989 and immediately got interested in the history of the town. And one of the local historians that was really active at that time was Gladys Seufert. And she was married to Francis Seufert, who wrote the book about the Seufert Cannery. And she took many of the photos that appeared in that book. So it was kind of through her that I started to kind of get interested in the fishing and the canning industry. So without further introduction, we'll get into the program today. We're going to talk about salmon fishing, and canning, and the folks that did a lot of work in the canning industry here in the Pacific Northwest, the Chinese cannery crews. Can you hear me okay, Susan? Maybe not.
Yes, you can hear.
I can hear, I just can't understand. I need subtitles.
Oh.
But that's all right.
Okay.
I know some of this already.
Okay. The Seufert brothers, located here in the Dalles on the Oregon side of the Columbia River, just a little upstream of the Dalles, employed a skilled crew of Chinese workers from the inception of their cannery in 1896 until well into the 1940s. In 1953, the cannery was closed and sold to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for the construction of the Dalles Dam. To pull together this presentation about the Seufert Cannery and the Chinese work crew, we've relied on written documents and summaries from the Seufert Brothesr Cannery, which are in the collections of the Oregon Historical Society, to which Francis and Gladys Seufert donated many of the company records, which is really a kind of an unparalleled event in canning history. You know, there were a ton of canneries working along the Columbia and along the coast during the heyday of salmon canning. And as far as I know, the only company records that really survive with any kind of completeness are the Seufert family ones. So that was a lot of forethought and really concern about the history that they kept those company records and then donated them to the Oregon Historical Society, where they're going to be, you know, a great reference to really look back on this era and this industry. We consulted the records and photograph collection at the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center and Museum, and also the Wasco County Historical Society provided some photos as well. So it's really been trying to kind of pull all these things together to tell a little bit more of a complete story. And this is kind of the beginning of that research. I think when I went to do the research at the Oregon Historical Society, I scanned 600 or so documents that are related to the Chinese and the employees at the cannery. And I've only waded through the first 20 or 30. So there's going to be a lot of compilation that comes from doing all of that. So something to think about in the future. So it was the salmon that really made this industry. Really, you don't have salmon canning without salmon. And really, the runs here on the Columbia River were among the most amazing runs in the world. Modern salmon have been part of the Pacific Northwest coast ecosystem for the last 6 million years. So they've been around as various and assorted species for a long time. The historic run zone on the Columbia River were between 6 and 10 million fish coming through in a year. So, and they ran seasonally, and different species ran at different times and had different places where they spawned and laid their eggs. Some, you know, all the way into the Walla Lake in eastern Oregon, up the Snake River and into Idaho, up, you know, to Kettle Falls and above Kettle Falls and into the headwaters of the Columbia. So it's really an amazing distribution all throughout the Columbia Basin, where these fish kind of came back to every year to breed. And because of this widespread nature of the salmon, the native communities really relied on salmon for much of their subsistence, particularly here in the interior, Northwest and in the Columbia Basin. You know, they fished here from time immemorial, and their treaties that they signed eventually with the U.S. government, one of the key provisions would be that they would be able to continue to fish in their traditional ways in their traditional areas. And that they hold those rights to this day. So it's really a testament to them that the salmon, you know, maintained a viable industry up until, you know, dams and development and stuff really decimated their numbers. So here's some views of native fishermen at Celilo Falls, where they did most of their fishing even up until the falls were inundated by the Dalles Dam. And then that lower right image is of the Seufert Brothesr Cannery, and so the salmon basically being unloaded from a dump truck onto the floor of the cannery. So they were caught in the tons. I think Seufert Brothers were reported to catch 250,000 or process 250,000 salmon each year. So that's a lot of fish. So Chinese first started to become employed in the canning industry really right at its inception. So canning really didn't develop along the Columbia River and along the West Coast until the 1860s. And one of the first successful canneries on the Columbia River was operated by a gentleman named Hume. And he opened up his cannery in the 1860s, and almost from the onset, he was having trouble getting employees. And he had employed a Chinese cook, and his Chinese cook suggested that, well, perhaps you need to hire more Chinese. And so he did so. He got a whole crew of Chinese, and they really made, canning possible. This is the 1870 census for that part. His cannery was on the Washington side of the river near the mouth. And this is kind of a detailed view, and you can see down on the bottom, Sam Mott. So he was the cook of Hume's cook. And then, the Chinese really did everything within the canneries, especially these early canneries, everything from making the cans, butchering the salmon, putting the salmon in the cans, processing, cooking the salmon in the cans, sealing up the cans, labeling the cans, making sure the cans didn't leak, loading them up into crates for shipping, loading them on the boxcars or the ships. It was pretty much relied on Chinese labor to do everything. So here's kind of to give you an overview of just how numerous canneries were. This is an 1887 map, so kind of during the early height of canning here in the Pacific Northwest. You can see this is the lower part of the river from Astoria to Portland, and especially in the Astoria and in those lower tidal portions of the Columbia, it's just littered with canneries, right? There's canneries all over the place. That one on the upper part that says Eagle Cliff Cannery, that was the first one that Hume opened up in the 1860s. So from that initial canneries sprung up all over the place. And one of the things about them is they all relied on Chinese labor. And then this is the upriver portion of that same map from Portland to the Dalles. And it shows less canneries up here. So there were some located, in Warrendale, Dodson area, down near the Cascades. And then mostly, it was the Seufert Brothesr Cannery here in the Dalles. There were a couple of other smaller canneries here, but they eventually all kind of got absorbed by the Seufert Brothers into their cannery. At the height of their cannery, they were, processing 250,000 fish a year, shipping the salmon out. They had a large market in New York that they shipped to. They also shipped internationally into England, all throughout the Midwest and the West Coast. So it was a really going concern. And there was a competition between these upriver salmon canneries and the downriver salmon canneries. And the way that the fishing worked is, at least for, I think the spring run, they take a week off to kind of allow, or no, it was the fall run. They take a week off to allow a certain number of salmon to kind of escape all the fishermen and make it upstream to spawn. But of course the problem with that is it was like a blanket week-long for the entire river, right? So you'd have that week starting, and so the people down in Astoria would stop catching fish, and the people in the Dalles would stop catching fish. And then that week would go by, and about the time that the salmon that missed all of those nets down by Astoria were getting up to the Salado Falls, fishing season would start again. So they might have missed that early gauntlet, but they didn't miss the secondary gauntlet. And so there was a lot of kind of complaining back and forth about whose fault it was once the salmon started to decline, whether it was the fish wheels up here or the the gill netting and seine netting down in the lower Columbia that was the cause of it all, but really it was mostly just overfishing all along and loss of habitat. So this is a really beautiful Benjamin Gifford photograph that the Wasco County Historical Society shared. And you can see it shows two different kinds of fish wheels. So kind of in the middle right-hand side, back behind that rock is one of the permanently placed fish wheels. So it's secured and anchored to that rock, and the fish wheel is lowered or raised depending on the flow of the river. Most of these fish wheels only worked really well during like the spring runoff when the river was really high. And then to the left of that, kind of back behind where the boat is a fish wheel scow. So it was actually a floating fish wheel that could be hauled to different locations and set up and anchored, and then the fish would then, usually they put it in a place where there was a constriction in the river or in the rocks where the fish couldn't really avoid getting scooped out by the fish wheel. So the way those things worked is they'd lower them down into the current. The current would spin the wheel. The wheel would kind of scoop out the salmon, and then they'd go into a chute, and then they'd kind of fill up a little bulkhead where then they could be offloaded onto a boat if that was easier, or off onto shore to kind of be then taken to the cannery. So all the permanent fish wheels were owned by companies. So either the Seuferts owned them or other companies on the North Shore. Eventually the Seuferts ended up owning almost all of the permanent fish wheels. They also owned most of the fishing scows. So they'd fish during the day, and then they'd hoist the wheel up at night so they wouldn't fish at night because it was illegal to fish at night. So that's kind of how those work. But they also used seine netting, so where they'd come to a shallow part of the river with a gravel bar, and they'd have a boat there, and they'd lay the net out with the boat, but have it anchored to the shore on one end. And then they'd kind of string it out around that bar, and then they'd quickly hook it up to a team of horses, and then use the horses to kind of pull the fish in the net into shore. And that was a very effective way, but it also, the gravel bars were where the salmon spawned. So they'd be kind of dragging the salmon out as they were spawning. So it wasn't really a good method if you wanted to conserve the fish fry. The other thing they did is they'd have gill nets set in the river as well. Then those harvested by boat, and then the boats would deliver the fish to the cannery. Some of these were, Seufert employees, and others were fishermen that were kind of independent. And then the independent fishermen would then sell their catch to buyers. So the Seuferts had buyers out at all of the major fishing locations, so you bring their catch. The price per pound would have been set at the beginning of the season by the Downriver Fishermen's Union. And so mostly that was met, unless somebody was trying to buy a little extra salmon, and then they boost the price up, and then everybody would have to kind of adjust the price depending on how much salmon they needed. So it was a fairly stable situation, though. But the Seuferts kind of owned a monopoly. They owned the cables that went out to the Celilo Islands. So if you were using the cables to get out to your fishing platform, you were expected to then sell your catch to the Seuferts. The Seuferts owned much of the shoreline, so they controlled who fished at the shoreline, and if you were fishing at the shoreline, you were expected to sell them your fish. So, they had a great demand for fish, and they had a lot of control over the fishing as well. So. Oops. So, I talked a little bit earlier about Gladys Seufert and the Seufert family. Gladys and her husband kind of, along with Thomas Baum at the Oregon Historical Society, worked on producing this book, which is kind of the story of the Seufert Brothesr Cannery. And the Oregon Historical Society published it in 1980, right about, I think, when Francis Seufert passed away. It's a lot of stories about the cannery and how the fishing industry worked. It talks about the Chinese crew, it talks about the cannery, it talks about how fishing worked. It's really the most in-depth kind of account of how really the salmon industry worked in this part of the country. And it's really an entertaining and invaluable read, and really an invaluable resource to historians. But of course, it's pretty much one person's recollection, who was right there, of how things worked. So that's really valuable because you don't often get those. I mean, he goes into kind of the minutia of how cans were made and all of those kind of things that aren't generally captured in the historic record. They certainly aren't in the company records anywhere. So that makes this book and kind of the story of the Seufert Brothesr Cannery so interesting and really so important to historians kind of trying to understand and interpret this. But it's also one man's view, right? So it's a little bit biased. You go to the newspaper accounts from the day and you get kind of another bias. There's a lot of accounts from the lower river folks complaining about the upper river folks there and stories. So there's it maybe gives a little bit more balance once you start looking at other things, but it is really a crucial source and a really good source. So here's an early picture of the Seufert Brothesr Cannery. As I said, it was in business at that location from 1896 to 1954. There had been an earlier cannery there when the Seufert Brothers bought the property in the 1880s, but it was a small cannery, and as soon as they got the funds, they enlarged it, built a new cannery, and really went to town. So the cannery canned not just salmon, but they also canned fruits and vegetables and seasonal goods. And if you look at, we'll show some aerial pictures later, but you can see the cannery and you can see that it's surrounded by vineyards and orchards and gardens. So they canned a lot of their own orchard and fruit production there as well. And it really worked out well for them because if the salmon runs were running a little bit light for a month and they had a whole crew there, then they could just shift them over to working on fruit or other things. So it was a good way to run their business. And you can see painted on the roofs of the structure, the one structure has the cannery name on it. The structure to the left, a barn, has basically a protest sign on it. So they're noting that their business had been grossly affected by the laws, both from Oregon and from Washington, that outlawed the use of fish wheels. So in, I think, 1926 in Oregon and in 1934 in Washington, the voters outlawed the use of fish wheels in the fishing industry. So after that time, the Seuferts relied a lot more on the Native American fishermen at Celilo to supply the fish for their cannery. But it was kind of a financial hit for them, and they kind of made that plain by painting their objections on the top of their barn. And off to the left there, that's the old Columbia River Highway, so anybody traveling down the highway would have seen that sign. And off on the right is the railroad. Them being at kind of a prime location there, right at the start of the construction of the Dalles, meant that, you know, over the years, they kind of lost some property and stuff. So they built the Celilo Canal. They had to purchase property from the Seuferts when they changed the railroad grade. They had to, you know, purchase property from the Seuferts. And when they put the highway through, they had to do that as well. So you know, those early years, the transportation didn't really go through so much. So later, they benefited from being able to truck things, but they also kind of lost some property and access in the process. So this is an aerial view showing the cannery. Let's see if I can find my laser pointer. I'm going to have to point it the right direction. Can't really see it. anyway, right about in the center is the cannery building, and I'll zoom in on that. There you can see the main cannery building and some of the ancillary buildings, and you can see the tall trees planted as windbreaks, and then some of the orchards and vineyards as well. So it was a complex that included both the cannery buildings, it included bunkhouses for both the white workers and the Chinese workers, mess halls, all of that kind of stuff that it takes to kind of run a business like that. And then we're fortunate that there's a few maps that show it as well. So on the left is a 1909 Sanborn fire insurance map. The main building is on the left, and then some of the houses and other buildings are shown. It doesn't show where the Chinese bunkhouses are on that map, but it has a little arrow that points to where they would have been. The map on the right is from an insurance appraisal of the Seufert Brothers that's at the Oregon Historical Society. It's a great document because it describes every building, what's in every building, how it's made, what kind of equipment are there, what the fire resources are. But it also included this map that kind of shows the layout in a little bit more detail. So it's oriented kind of 90 degrees at the last one, and I'm going to go point to where the Chinese bunkhouse is because my laser pointer isn't working. So this is the Columbia River here, and this is 15 Mile Creek, so right at the confluence of the two. This is a fish wheel right there, and this is the main cannery building.
So Eric, would that be where the split rail fence is now?
Yeah, there's a split rail fence that goes along 5 Mile Creek, and then it kind of comes out to a little point where you can overview where the dam is.
Yes.
That's about where the Chinese bunkhouse was. So, since we're interested in the China crew, the Seuferts kept pretty good records. Sometimes they're a little hard to read, and sometimes they're kind of spread out into multiple books, but with a little bit of work, you can kind of dig through them and see what's going on. So, the 1902 stuff is from some handwritten notes, which were a little bit hard to read, so kind of the spelling is about as close as I could get them from reading those notes. But you can see that there's a lot of different jobs listed for the folks that were working for them, and that the foreman got the most, got $50 a month. Then the butchers were kind of the most critical people of the salmon canning crew, because if you didn't have a good butcher, you didn't end up with good fish to can. And they also had to be really quick, because they had to keep up with those thousands of salmon being delivered each day. So it tended to be, they talked about having one butcher that worked for them for over 20 years. So they really tried to keep the butchers happy and to keep working with the same labor contractor over the years that would provide them, an experienced crew. So there was kind of a first butcher and a secondary butcher, and then at least in 1902 they were still hand making their cans. So there's some of the Chinese that kind of specialized in soldering or joining the cans together and putting the lids on top of the cans. And so they're reflected in that as well. There's Chinese that kind of loaded the retorts where the salmon got cooked. There were Chinese that were known as slimers, who were the ones that kind of washed the salmon before they got to the butchers. So kind of a variety of skills needed, and depending on how skilled you were and how long you worked was kind of how much you got paid. And basically the way this worked is the China crew was typically 20 to 30 people. They would come as a crew out of Portland, generally speaking. The company would pay for train tickets, and they get a special car, and they run the car all the way up to the cannery, and then the Chinese crew would come, and the Chinese crew would be here from April through October. And they'd work six days a week, so every day except Sunday. Sunday was also the day that the fishery was closed, so that the fish could kind of make their way through and spawn. They worked 10-hour days, and if they had to work Sunday or had to work over 10 hours a day, they were paid overtime. So the Seuferts kept a book of the overtime expenses for each individual employee. The crews were, I think they had trouble with the names and keeping track of folks, so they gave each Chinese crew member a number as well as their name. So they kept track of all of that. You can see it's kind of the 1902 one on the left, and then the 1941 kind of shows one of the books that's more legible. So that's the work crew in June and how many hours they put in and which days they were there. In case somebody got sick, they got docked time and things like that. But anyway, as part of the work there, the Seuferts also provided housing. So they had a bunkhouse where everybody kind of lived together. They also provided food, so they had a cook hired as well as part of the China crew. And then they had a mess hall where they did all the cooking and also a hall where everybody gathered for meals. Part of the Seuferts' contract with the labor contractor also said that they'd provide garden space for the Chinese so they could grow their own fresh vegetables and also have some livestock. So they kept some pigs and ducks and chickens as well, which they used to feed the crew throughout the time that they were there. And early on, one of the, before people started kind of commuting to work and most of the crew were living there, both whites and Chinese in the bunkhouses, they have a morning break and Seuferts had a contract with one of the bakeries here in the Dalles, and the bakery would drive out with pastries, and so they'd have a morning break and have coffee and pastries for half an hour or something like that, and then get back to work. So this is kind of what it looked like. So these are about 1940. Gladys Seufert took some pictures of the inside of the cannery and what was going on. So this was kind of getting near the end of the fish cannery. Fish runs had started to decline. The Grand Coulee Dam had been built across the Columbia in 1941 without any kind of fish ladders. So that kind of negated the fish runs all the way up from there up into Canada. So it closed the fishery at Kettle Falls. It really had a devastating effect on the salmon and on the Native American tribes. A later dam, the Chief Joseph Dam, was also built without fish ladders, so that closed off even more of the river to salmon migration. Right now, the tribes are working with both the Corps and the Bureau of Reclamation to see if they can work around that, if they can retrofit dams with fish ladders or truck fish around or try and reintroduce the salmon into some more of their historic range. But we'll see how that goes. It's going to be expensive. But you can see on the lower left is one of the Chinese butchers butchering salmon. And then you can just see the cannery floor just covered with salmon waiting to be butchered. So the Chinese were provided housing. So Gladys Seufert in 1965, before these structures were torn down, took some pictures. So the China house where the Chinese crew lived is on the left-hand side. This is a later version, I think, built in the 1920s after an earlier one burned down. And that earlier one burned down, then the Chinese crew was then housed in buildings in Chinatown and Portland for the time it took to reconstruct that. And then there was an outside structure which was called the steam bath. I'm not exactly sure how that worked, but it's kind of an interesting structure. Inside the mess hall, they had a wood-fired stove that I think had 4 woks going at a time. So. And one of the woks is preserved there at the Discovery Center. So if you go to the Discovery Center and look at the Seufert display, one of the big woks is there on display. So the Chinese crew was hired as a group through labor contractors. So these were folks that really specialized in finding labor for railroads and for other construction projects and for canneries. Things that needed large crews willing to kind of work in remote areas. So one of the biggest labor contractors in Oregon was a guy named Seufert, and that's his story on the left-hand side. So he came to the US basically as a penniless immigrant, worked his way up to becoming one of the major merchants in Portland, and a labor contractor who supplied labor not only to pretty much all of the Columbia River canneries, but also to the railroads that were under construction in the 1880s and 1890s. So he, supplied crews of thousands of people to these various organizations. Interestingly enough, his son then became a lawyer who kind of specialized in immigration law. So he represented some of the Chinese community here in the Dalles, as well as Fred Wilson also was a representative of them during some of their immigration issues. For at least a few years, a local merchandise store and labor contractor here in the Dalles at 208 East 1st Street also had the contract or supplemented the contract for Chinese laborers at the Seufert Cannery. And they were related to Seufert. It was Jacqui and his family, and the store they had was the Wing Yuan Company at 208 East 1st, so just one door to the west of the Wing Hong High building that's still standing. This is a picture of his family, taken I think around 1915 or so, when they were operating the store here in the Dalles. This is when his family had, probably about 5 or 6 years after his family had come to join him. As a merchant, he could bring his family from China, so that was one of the advantages of having a store. Between the two of them, the young boy standing there was his adopted son from China. His wife there is his second wife. Her name's Feng Shi. She came over, and then they had those 2 children, the 2 daughters there in the front, and eventually another son there. Were all born in the Dalles at the store there on 1st Street. So we have their immigration papers. Said Judd passed away suddenly in 1921. His wife and family stayed living and operating the store till 1926, when she decided they just needed to go back to China. So as part of the preparation for their return to China, they filled out all of the immigration paperwork that they needed to have at least the children returned at a later date. So they filled out all of the documents that proved that they were born in the U.S. and as native born were U.S. citizens. On the right is these all came from the National Archives in Seattle. And on the right is a statement signed by one of the partners in the company. And you can see that it's notarized by Arthur Seufert. So not only did the Seuferts kind of employ the Chinese as a crew, they also kind of testified for them and helped them through kind of some of the immigration issues that they faced over the years. So this is, when you're doing this research, sometimes you stumble on things that you don't expect to find. This is a picture that Gladys Seufert, who was really interested in local history, took in 1962 of the Wing Hong High store when it was being used as a furniture exchange. So this is the oldest picture other than an 1894 flood picture we have of the building. So just to the right of this building is where said Judd had his store and where the kids were born, and when this was, built out as more of a Chinatown, and after it had gone away so much. So this is the Wing Yuan and Company stationery, where the 1920 labor contractors are all kept track of, and it kind of shows how much they were paid for the year, which is kind of interesting. I hadn't really done an analysis of how much they were making in the 1920s, but I did do a little bit of the stuff from 1902. Basically, you know, they were working 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, so 60 hours a week. So that comes to 240 hours a month. And when you adjust for inflation and stuff like that, the highest paid worker, the foreman, was getting about $7.65 an hour or something like that. And the lower paid employees were getting like $5.60 an hour. So they certainly weren't getting rich doing this, but it was kind of steady work and work that they were valued at and skilled at doing. So this kind of shows that group. Early on, the Sit family, who were the family of the contractors, seemed to dominate the crews as well. But as time goes by, you get a lot of different other Chinese surnames kind of mix in, Lees and Longs and Chins. So as kind of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 kind of stops the inflow of new Chinese immigrants, the workforce gets older and kind of more familial diversity comes in there as you're branching out further to kind of find workers for the cannery. They were managing to field a crew still into the 1940s, sometimes with American-born Chinese, so descendants of the earlier cannery workers were back and filling some of those slots. They also started relying on Japanese immigrants because Japanese were not restricted in the same way by the Exclusion Act. So for a while there, Japanese labor kind of filled in for the Chinese labor that was being lost. So this is an interesting little tidbit that was in one of the Exclusion Act files written by Arthur Seufert. As part of the process of getting pre-approved to travel to China, you had to have testimony by 2 white witnesses that would talk about whether they'd seen you doing any labor or anything else like that, things that would make you so that you could no longer be a merchant, and so thus you could not bring your family, or you could not return from China after you went to China. So it was kind of crucial to have good white witnesses. And Arthur and Francis Seufert both served as witnesses to some of the Chinese community here in the Dalles. And this one was really kind of good because, you know, they kind of ask them how many times they go into the store and how familiar they are with them and things, and then if they ever buy anything. And, you know, he says, well, I never really bought anything. I go to their store a number of times, and they have occasionally given me tea. I never bought anything there, but they often give me little articles just for the sake of friendship. So, you know, you get the feeling that you know, they know each other, they kind of appreciate each other, and they all know that they kind of have a role to play in the complicated game of employment and immigration. So in the files at the Oregon Historical Society, there's also, you know, some personal letters. There's a couple of letters from, especially later on, there's a letter from one of the Chinese contract workers wondering about why he hadn't had enough taken out of his federal taxes and why he was going to owe a big federal tax bill, which is probably not an unusual kind of correspondence to have. But then there's another one kind of written on a personal note by a gentleman that had been in the employ of the Seufert Cannery for a number of years, in the 1930s up till the 1940s, until he was drafted into the Army during World War II. And he's kind of just asking, sent a letter to Arthur Seufert just to ask how he and the family were. And he receives a reply from Francis Seufert saying that Arthur had died the year before, so he was going to kind of saying that he remembered him and fondly from the cannery days, and was, you know, sad that he was suffering. At this point, he was the Chinese gentleman really was in the hospital with jaundice. So there's a little bit back and forth. There's kind of 3 letters between them where they kind of express their reminiscences and fond wishes for each other. So the cannery era really started ending, you know, with the construction of the dams in the 1930s, but there were a lot of other reasons that kind of drove the end of the cannery era. On the left-hand side is a 1904 Oregonian where it talks about the fishery declining, fish disappearing, the canners are killing the golden goose kind of thing. Overfishing was taking on, was becoming a thing at that time. And that's part of that squabble between the lower river and the upper river. This article was actually written by Arthur Seufert. So there's that kind of competition going on. So it's like, you know, that kind of thing that when those resources get kind of concentrated, then everybody's kind of scrambling to get the last little bit. So that even makes it decline faster. So that's was kind of what triggered some of those laws that outlawed fish wheels and things like that, and tried to more regulate the fishing industry. But even with some of those laws, the fish just kind of faced insurmountable obstacles, from habitat loss, from the logging that kind of, you know, more sediment in the streams, making the spawning more difficult. Agricultural water diversion and runoff, meaning there was less water in the river for them. And then, of course, the dams. But the Chinese Exclusion Act also plays a role there, right? Because in 1882, once you started excluding Chinese laborers, the labor cost for canning starts going up. Some of that is made up for by automation, right? They switched to more automated can machines in 1904 at the Seufert Cannery. So instead of having somebody solder the tops on every single can, you now have a machine that crimps the top on every single can. So that speeds up the process. But interestingly enough, the Chinese crew kind of stays the same in number. It's always between 20 and 35 people on the crew. So there's always work to do at the cannery. Even if you kind of start automating things well, then the machines have to be maintained. And then other things have to take place. So you know, and then maybe you have to switch to an 8-hour day because of state law. so there's kind of this balance that gets maintained between the labor and the automation. But really, it was just the decline of the salmon runs that really kind of spelled the end of the canning. So, and here we have a picture of the Dalles Dam. So, put in 1957. We have in the paperwork at the Oregon Historical Society, there's a receipt for legal services from the Seuferts for negotiating with the Corps of Engineers for the sale of their land and property. So what happened to the old cannery? Well, after the Army Corps of Engineers bought it, there was a lot of wrangling back and forth. Francis Seufert was kind of pushing for state parks to take it over and make it into a state park. The Army Corps of Engineers was kind of want to let go of their new federal property. So eventually the Wasco County Court intervened and signed a lease with the Army Corps of Engineers and started using the cannery as both an archaeological lab for the excavations that were kind of ongoing at that time related to the building of the dam, and also for a museum. And this was supposed to be just kind of a temporary museum while the federal government and the county and the state got together to make a more permanent natural and cultural history museum here in the Dalles. That didn't really happen until the Olympia Gorge Discovery Center. So anyway, at least for a while, the cannery got put to good use. Eventually, the Corps of Engineers decided it was more trouble than it was worth. And when the lease ran out, they burned down the cannery. Of course, after the museum was moved out, luckily. And so now the cannery site is Seufert Park, so over near the visitor center for the for the dam. You can go walk trails around there. 5 Mile Creek is there on the right, the mouth of it there. On the right-hand side, you can kind of see the area where the Chinese bunkhouses and mess hall. And of course, none of this would be possible without a lot of help from a lot of different people who kind of generously donated their time and expertise to this project. Susan at the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center and Museum spent a good day helping me dig through photographs and stuff. The research library staff at Oregon Historical Society kind of hosted me for the better part of a week going through the corporate records. Julie Reynolds has been going through some of the photographic collection at the Wasco County Historical Society, so she's made an Excel spreadsheet so she can search for things and pull them out and blend them to me, so that was fantastic. The Seattle branch of the National Archives is where a lot of those immigration papers are at, so they've been very helpful among the years. Kind of the irony of it is that with that collection, we kind of know more about some of the kind of regular people in the Dalles that were Chinese than we know about their contemporaries. So just simply because they were regulated by that Exclusion Act, so they had to kind of testify about their personal history and their businesses got inspected and all of that kind of stuff. So that's all preserved in the National Archives. And then that article that I showed a picture of that had set Buck, the contractor from Portland, that was actually an article that was in a 1915 publication kind of espousing the virtues of Portland and trying to get people to come to Portland. And we kind of stumbled upon that one time when we went just a couple of weeks ago to tea at Victor Trevitt's Bourbon House Tea Shop. And his visitors, his mom and Eric Stovall and Corliss Marsh were busy kind of tearing this book apart because it had been water damaged. And they showed us those pictures and then kind of lent that book to us so we could kind of use it for this presentation. So that was kind of a fortunate turn of events. And then, of course, always the board here at the courthouse makes all of these things possible. So I'm also supposed to remind you not to forget that there's coffee, tea, and cookies downstairs after the program, but we'll do the raffle first. Any questions, if there's any questions?
Could you give the name of the book you're showing us downstairs? We couldn't see the book when they showed the book. We couldn't see the title or that very book where it was in the back. Okay, so Wheels of Fortune. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yes, Julie.
What were the names of the Seufert brothers?
So Julie asked what the names of the Seufert brothers were. That's a good question. So there was Arthur Seufert and I think E.J. Seufert. So there's like generations of Seuferts, and I kind of get them all confused, and I haven't gotten the time sat down to kind of make a family tree of them. But
Arthur was the father.
The father of Francis. Yeah. Yes.
I'm wondering if you have any information about the numbers of salmon. When did they begin to count? How did they determine X number?
Yeah, well, so the Seuferts were really good at keeping track of this, right? Because they had to buy each individual salmon. Yeah, so those are estimates, right? I think they're kind of, that's kind of a broad range of 6 to 10 million, so I'm sure they're kind of at best estimates. Any other questions? Yes.
When was the cannery burned down?
Phil asked when the cannery was burned down. I don't know the exact date of that. I think, does anybody know? Susan says 1973.
I've got the date at work, but I forget the precise date, but
Sometime when it was cold and snowy in 1973.
And the other comment I had was in the late 50s, after the cannery shut down, in the early 60s, the precursor of the Dalles Cherry Festival took place out there, and they had a home show in the cannery, and they would have the crowning of the Cherry Festival Queen. And they brought in some national acts to perform and play the music. And so that was kind of like the home show with all these little venues and eating that food. And that ran probably until 63 or 64.
So Phil just mentioned that in the 1960s, after the salmon cannery was no longer canning, that the Cherry Festival's kind of origins were there at the cannery, and they had a home show and elected the Cherry Festival Queen and things like that. Yes.
Sometime before it was burnt down, it was also the home of the Mid-Columbia livestock auction. After the auction, the first memory of that event was out at the auction yards before the freeway went through on the west side. So then, apparently, because of the freeway and the location where it went to that facility, and then of course after that was gone, it's out to Fairfield.
Okay. Yeah, Carolyn mentioned that it had also been used for livestock auction.
It was the one they do for kids in the spring.
Oh, for the 4-H?
After the fair.
That stock show for a while, and then they changed it to Wheat League.
Well, yeah, we sponsored it.
Oh, okay. Any other questions? Julie?
How long was the Windpot Museum in the building?
That's a good question. So 73 was when it moved. Susan, any idea when the museum, the Windpot opened up it there? It was in the 50s, wasn't it?
The Windpot Museum opened when they were doing the Wolfman Mound dig over by Horse Thief. They needed a place to stage the archaeology. And I think that they were bringing things over in the early 50s. I want to say 53 because that's when the Wasco County Dalles City Museum Commission was formed, specifically to operate the Windpot Museum.
And that's about when the Seuferts sold the cannery to the Army Corps, so probably about 1953 to 1973, so 20 years. Yeah, Wayne?
Question and a comment. The question is, what did they do with the fish? Entrails, heads, tails, guts?
So the Chinese butchers actually kind of would bag up some of the heads and sell them to the natives. And then also, but most of the guts and stuff were washed. They had a chute that they constructed that went down to the river, so they'd run water through the chute and just dump the guts into there, and then it would get dumped into the river. For a while they had a box that kind of out there that it kind of washed to this box, and then they had hired a native gentleman in a wagon to kind of collect it all and then spread it out in the orchards that they had to kind of fertilize the orchards. That didn't last but one season because the crows came and started picking at all of the things, and then the wind changed and they could smell the kind of the rotting fish guts. So the next year they dug a trench, or a series of trenches, and then dumped all the entrail into the series of trenches. But then it started to affect, the first couple of years it was good for the trees, and then after that it wasn't so good for the trees because evidently the oil from the salmon remains kind of cemented the sediment together. So it made almost an impermeable layer around the trees so that the water couldn't get to them. So they had to hire somebody to come and dynamite those edges. So after that, they just let the entrails go into the river where the carp and the suckers and everything else is. Yeah, Phil?
How big of property or acreage did the Seufert own out there for the cannery was and not? Did they do any of the orchard and farming?
So they did some of the orchard and farming immediately around, and for, I don't know exactly how big the property was. It was fairly extensive there around the cannery, but they also owned the riverbank for quite some ways from there up until kind of the foot of the falls. So they had a lot of property. Yeah.
Well, another thing they used to do out there is hunter safety courses. When the kids needed to do their live shooting, they did that in the cannery.
Oh. Okay, so the cannery was used for live shooting for hunter safety as well. Yeah.
I had a conversation with Randy Barrett, who's involved with the cannery up on Mill Creek. He said that some of the equipment out of that cannery ended up in their cannery. They're probably some still operating today.
Any other questions? Well, I guess we'll get on with the raffle.